Dickheads, like a pink laser beam of truth beaming from the golden age of science fiction to your brain hole. We have a return guest to sit in the victim's chair for the Dickheads podcast, and that's Alec Nevala-Lee, who was on our podcast several years ago, actually. 2020, he was on our Scholars Lockdown panel. But Alec and I have podcasted many times on Postcards from a Dying World. We've done a couple episodes of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. He joined me on Twilight, John W. Campbell's story, and Asimov's Nightfall. So and I promised him that I'm going to do one of his favorite authors in the future, and I got to get back to that. So Alec is the author of Astounding, the combined biography of John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and L. Ron Hubbard. It's essentially a history of the golden age of science fiction because he talks about lots of other authors than just these four. He also wrote a book on Buckminster Fuller, which I've read. And then you have another book coming out, which I don't know as much about because you haven't finished it yet, or it hasn't come out yet. But he's a great researcher and historian, so that's primarily what we're going to talk about. Alec, can you tell folks how you got into science fiction and specifically wanting to write the history of it?
Sure. Well, thanks, David, for the intro. And it's funny because you were mentioning all the times we've been on different podcasts together, and honestly, it's like a big blur. Like
Right.
I was like, I've been on this podcast before, and like the Lockdown Scholars, podcast. I mean, 2020, right? It seems like
Yeah,
a million
five
years
years
ago.
ago.
Wow. Okay. Well, I should go back and watch that. I haven't watched that since it first aired.
Oh, that was
Um,
with Lisa Yazik and Gary Wolf as well. So
yeah.
appreciate
It
the
was
guy.
it was a good lineup. Folks, I tend to cross paths with a fair amount. Because yeah, I mean, it's funny because like we're all kind of like science fiction scholars, which is a smaller world than you might think, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's exactly as small as you think it would be. And I'm kind of like a late comer to this world. Someone like Gary has been, looking at this stuff for decades. I arrived at it through kind of a roundabout way. I originally was a science fiction writer for Analog. So if you know the magazine Analog Science Fiction, in fact, it is the current incarnation of astounding science fiction, which is, which makes it the oldest continuously published science fiction magazine in the world, I believe. Um, and I've been publishing short fiction in Analog for a while. I published my first story there in 2003, I want to say. Um, and I really enjoy writing short fiction. I got to know the editors there pretty well. And at one point, it occurred to me because I was trying to pivot from novel writing to nonfiction writing that I could write a book-length study of that magazine. And essentially, the plan was initially to read every issue of Astounding, at least every issue from maybe what you call the Golden Age, and just like write a history of the magazine, like how the genre evolved, what you can learn about the history of science fiction in America from this one magazine. And that would have been a really cool book. It's not quite the book I ended up writing, right? Because within, I would say, a day of looking into this idea, I realized that nobody had ever written a biography of John W. Campbell, who was the editor of Astounding during its most, famous period. And to me, this is still shocking. The fact that this subject was just kind of lying around for someone to pick it up, because Campbell is the ideal subject for this kind of biography, like a big literary biography, because he is controversial, he is important, he had an incredibly weird like personal life. His life has a lot of narratively interesting twists and turns. All right, and so it was kind of like a slam dunk subject
Right.
for this kind of book. Um, and so immediately I kind of like switched gears and said, okay, this is a biography of Campbell because this is a great subject that I want to write before someone else gets there first. And the last little bit I'll mention is that originally I went out to publishers with the pitch of this being a book about Campbell. And the editor who took this project eventually at Day Street Books said, Campbell is really interesting, but he is not famous enough to justify a book like this. He is not familiar enough to mainstream readers. Can you suggest a few other people who would fall into a group biography with Campbell at the center? And I said, well, if you start with Campbell and you expand that circle outward, the first three names that fall into it are Asimov, Heinlein, and Hubbard. And she said, that sounds great. Because those guys are interesting, much more well known than Campbell was. So it kind of organically became a group biography. And I mean, if you've read it, you know that it covers a lot of ground. It's these four writers, their various wives and families, other writers, obviously, fans, interesting peripheral figures. It ended up being a much bigger and more complex book than I had originally intended, but it was fun to write. And it came out in 2018, and years later, I'm still being asked to talk about it. So that's been very gratifying.
Right. And well, so you have some guys here, David Gill, Frank Hollander, Lord Running Clam, myself, who have all dug very deep into PKD. And so, a couple of us have gone to the archives, and Lord Running Clam's been writing about PKD since the 80s. And so for us, like, we know those places and those things, but what kinds of archives and things did you have to do and dig into to get into these particular authors? Because it's a whole nother era, it's a whole nother ball of worms, right?
Yeah, so I never would have pitched this book if I hadn't known that there were archives available because these guys are all gone. There were still some writers who knew them personally who I could interview, but for the most part, you're relying on things like existing memoirs. A lot of people have a section about Campbell or about some of these writers kind of buried in one of um, their autobiographies. Um, but the other, resource is letters, right? And Campbell, as the central figure, it was obvious to me from day one. I had to get my hand on as many Campbell letters as possible. So the story behind Campbell's letters is actually kind of interesting. So there was a fan named Perry Chapdelaine, who was a sort of tangential figure in science fiction for decades, was part of the early history of Scientology, and was kind of like, I mean, a little bit of like I would say a little bit controversial in some ways. He had a lot of things going on. And among the things he did was, I believe in the late 70s, he acquired the rights to all of Campbell's correspondence. He struck some kind of arrangement with Campbell's widow, Peg, took possession of the archives themselves, like the physical letters, and published a few volumes of selections from those letters. So there's a paperback that I acquired pretty early on called the John W. Campbell Correspondence, or the John W. Campbell Letters. And there were different editions, I think some of which are only available on Kindle, devoted to Campbell and I think Asimov and Van Vogt and some other folks. Um, but that's like a fraction of the total. And the physical letters, I believe, are in San Diego. Um, but I learned early on that there were microfilm reels. So thousands of letters had been, at great expense, apparently, by Perry Chapdelaine, have been scanned and converted to microfilm. And
And the
so it
reason
took me,
why, by the way, that they're in San Diego is because there's a guy who was a huge Scientologist who was a benefactor to the library at SDSU. And so they have a giant Hubbard room at the library with like Battlefield Earth maquettes and giant statues of John Travolta from Battlefield Earth. It's really hilarious.
wow,
I've been there. So
I actually did not know that. I never figured out why they
they
were in
call
San Diego.
they call it the science fiction reading room, and
Hmm.
it's there was a guy who was he had some connection to SDSU. I think he was an alumni, but he was a huge Scientology guy and donated. So it's funny because their science fiction room is like at least 50% L. Ron Hubbard.
Honestly, it sounds great. I'm actually a little surprised I've never gone down there. But now I'm going to add that to my list of places to visit.
All
Because
right,
yeah,
lunch
I
is
think
on me.
yeah, no, that'd be great. Because I actually never went down there in person, right? So this is the funny part. Like I've physically held like I mean have I actually held any Campbell letters? I don't know. I don't recall because what I did get my hands on were the microfilm reels, and so I was able to like get a library loan from I think the Library of Congress and maybe Texas A&M, and I semi clandestinely arranged to have them transferred to PDF form. I also spent many hours at a library microfilm reader going through some of the reels that I couldn't convert that way. So yeah, so I had thousands of letters to look at. I took notes on all of them. I was still kind of like learning like how to do this kind of work at the time, and I look back now, like I've written two other biographies since then, and I've become much more organized. And now my notes from Astounding are kind of like a big mess. It's just a big text file with a lot of cryptic annotations. But I looked at every page. I looked at every single page of Campbell's correspondence. Some of which is great. A lot of it is very routine. But every now and then you find like these tidbits, that end up being really important, and you never know what's going to matter down the line. So you just take notes on everything. The only thing that is unfortunate is that very little from before, I would say 1950, has survived. There are a few sort of isolated caches of letters. Like most of the Heinlein stuff is available in the Heinlein archives, which is a separate archive that provides PDFs to people who request them, and a few other like pieces. But the bulk of the correspondence, unfortunately, was from the period that I spend the least amount of time discussing in the book. This is the period after the 1950s, where Campbell is less, I would say, central to the development of science fiction. And so I just really wish I had more stuff from the 30s and 40s. Like more than anything else, I wish that stuff had been preserved. And maybe it's out there somewhere. Um, but I had to kind of like use what I had available. And so, sometimes Campbell will refer in like a sentence or two to an event that happened 20 years earlier, and you have to kind of like use these bits and pieces to assemble a picture of stuff from that time. And so you end up with like way more information than you could possibly want about certain things, and almost nothing about others.
Right. Well, and you had one extremely major find, which ended up being published. You want to tell the folks about that one because that one's really cool.
This is a whole other, kind of line of research. So it happened, and this goes back to reading every page of Campbell's letters. I was going through Campbell's letters, and I want to say this letter was from the 50s, where a librarian at Syracuse University had written to him asking if he had any manuscripts he wanted to donate to the science fiction collection there. And Campbell wrote back, said, sorry, everything that I had, all the manuscripts went to Harvard a few years ago, and I didn't keep anything else. And this is the first reference I'd ever seen to a box of manuscripts at Harvard, which no one had ever referred to. You look at other scholars, books about Campbell or this period, no mention of anything like this at Harvard. So I
Oh,
went to
I
the
love this
Harvard.
shit, Alec. This is great.
It gets better. All right. So I went to the Harvard University Library web page where you can do a search, the library's collection, and I look up John Campbell. First page of results, there's nothing. Second page, nothing. Third page, nothing. On the fourth page, there's a book saying John W. Campbell manuscripts. All right. The entry for that box is buried 4 pages in to the search results. So you would only know it was there if you were looking for it, if you already knew it was there. And so I was pretty sure that no one had opened this box since it first arrived at Harvard in 19 in the mid 50s. So I was able to get a list of the contents from the librarian, and so basically folders, and what are the names on the folder tabs, and they're all names of stories. And so the issue with this, okay, is that I wasn't sure if I really needed to look at the manuscripts for Campbell's stories, because his fiction, occupies a fairly small part of like Astounding, and this is not the kind of book that is like going to spend all the time on like minor textual differences between like the manuscript for The Mightiest Machine and the print version. And so I was like, okay, I don't know if I really need to like look at this stuff. It doesn't seem like that important. But then again, I was like, what if there is something here that's really interesting and somebody else finds it and I missed the chance because I didn't bother looking? So I said, okay, I should just see what's there. So I hired an assistant because I was unable to go to Harvard personally. And she scanned everything and sent them back to me, and I began to go through them. And I knew before I even looked at those files that there was one folder called Frozen Hell. And I knew that Frozen Hell was the original working title for Who Goes There. And so one of my secret hopes was that I would find some interesting differences between the text of, the original Frozen Hell manuscript and the published version of Who Goes There. I'm like, okay, that would be cool.
which evolved, of course, into the Howard Hawks movie and the John Carpenter movie.
The
Uh,
Thing.
were adapted from Who Goes There. Yeah.
Yes. So The Thing, I mean, and this is like a parenthetical remark. The Thing is the only thing that Campbell wrote as an author that still has value in terms of is this IP that is going to be adapted in the future. The Thing is still an incredibly valuable piece of IP. In a way that nothing else that Campbell wrote is. Even though he wrote a lot of good stories, The Thing kind of is in a different category, right? It's the thing that he is by far best known for in, I would say, the mainstream. So I was very curious to see what was there. And it turned out that the version of Frozen Hell, of Who Goes There, that was in Campbell's papers, had a 40-page section at the beginning, a whole new opening that had been cut from the published version that I'm pretty sure no one knew existed. It's basically, if you've seen The Thing or read the original, or the print version of that novella, it's about the discovery of this alien spaceship in the Antarctic. But the novella starts after the spaceship has been discovered and the alien body has been brought back to base. And then there's like a little flashback in dialogue form that explains how they found the spaceship. Um, in the original draft of Frozen Hell, there was this 40-page set piece about the discovery of the spaceship, some of which ended up in the print version, but most of which had never been seen before. So I got pretty excited. And my original thought was maybe we should publish this in analog. Maybe analog wants to serialize it or something. And so I went to Campbell's family, who I'd been in contact with before, and they did something very smart. They referred me to John Betancourt, who was the family's agent. And Betancourt, to his credit, realized what I did not, which is that this is an incredibly like valuable piece of material that we would, it would be unwise to simply give it to analog there's something here that we should develop. And so Betancourt said, we're going to do a Kickstarter. We're going to fund a publication of Frozen Hell in book form. All right. And I haven't looked at the Kickstarter page in a while, but offhand, I think the original goal was $1,000 to publish like a very like low budget print run. And I think they got to like $200,000. I mean, it far exceeded like their goals for this project. And so it ended up getting, hardcover, paperback, collector's edition, leather bound, all kinds of like, cool collector's items for Frozen Hell. I wrote the introduction to the book. Robert Silverberg wrote a preface as well. And the punchline is that about a year later, after it came out, I was online and I read that Blumhouse Pictures and Universal had optioned that book, Frozen Hell, for a potential third Thing movie. All right. And this would have, or actually a fourth Thing movie. And this would have been in 2020, maybe 2020. I know, I don't recall the exact date, but it said like, they've optioned the book. It's going to be fast tracked. Occasionally, I would see like stories where John Carpenter was asked whether he, was involved, and he would be very cagey and say, "Yeah, you never know." Obviously, nothing's happened, all right. But in some form, Frozen Hell is or was in development as another Thing movie. And so, if that ever happens, in some indirect way, you have me to blame.
Well, and for those of us who are archive nerds, it's just an amazing story that you were able to find this. It's just it's a really cool thing. Now, one thing that before I kind of open up the floor to questions, one thing I like to do with Alec when I have him on my podcast is we look at these original issues of these magazines and see what he has to say about them. And I've got, this is Stirring Stories from April 1941. Now, Frank Hollander and I argued whether this was the first, from my research, this is the first science fiction magazine that Philip K. Dick ever bought. Now, he wrote about a different Stirring Stories story in a different issue with the C.M. Kornbluth story that had a big impact on him, but that was not technically in the first one that he read. And I just wanted to look at see if there's anything that jumps out to you in this table of contents. This is Don Wollheim. I know he's not your focus, but this was the first science fiction magazine that our boy PKD bought. Is there any stories or anything that jumps out to you from this one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on stirring science stories, as you know, but Wolheim obviously is a hugely important figure in the field who began essentially as a troll in the fan community, kind of a rabble rouser among science fiction fans, but then became a hugely important editor and writer. Um, Obviously there are a lot of people who were friends of his from the Futurians period. So this is the club in the 30s that people like, just looking here, David Knight, Robert Lowndes, um, Wolheim, and also like Isaac Asimov and other folks, Fred Pohl remembers. And so you can tell that he's still drawing on some of those people, to populate his magazine.
And I know
Um,
that SD Goatmans, or I think that's a pen name that all of those Futurians
wow.
use.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think that's a I've from my research, I think that's a CM Cornblue story with under that name, but I don't know why they didn't use his name. But it could have been Wolheim doing two stories in a row because multiple authors use that pen name.
Wow. Okay. I didn't know that. That's interesting. And the only other thing that springs out is Hannes Bach did the cover illustration, and I'm pretty sure he did a bunch of illustrations for Astounding and or Unknown for this period. There's definitely someone whose work I recognize. But yeah, no, I mean, this is actually kind of fun for me to see because I looked at every issue of Astounding and Unknown, the other Campbell magazine from this period. But it's a huge world of pulps, right? An incredible world of pulps during this period that I barely looked at. There's so much stuff out there that I feel like a little bit. I mean, I've moved on to other projects, and so the odds of me going back and doing a deep dive into this period again seem kind of low. But I would love to spend more time exploring what was going on in like the magazines that weren't famous, that
Yeah.
didn't sort of get anthologized.
My favorite title here is Cosmophobia. Uh,
Yeah.
and then the rocket of 1955 is interesting too. But since this was 1941,
Oh, interesting. The Rock of 1955. Do you have this whole issue
yeah,
here?
actually, I have a physical copy of it too that I bought.
Can
But
you look
it
at that story? Because that one rings a bell. I wonder if I've seen that one somewhere.
Yeah, let's see, what page is that? 53. Let's scroll down. Um, but yeah, I ended up buying this issue because of its importance for us. But
Eggs, can you tell us real quick how we know that this is the first magazine that Dick bought? And
it's a combination of a couple different sources that he mentioned it in the Shifting Realities in
Oh, wow.
the self portrait essay that Stirring Stories um, was his first magazine.
Okay.
But the reason why I know it's this issue is correlating with letters and correspondence that I looked at the archive that he said it was the first one that he bought was in April, and this was the April 41 issue. So
does this predate the issue that has dead center in it that we know?
yes, it predates it, and
Okay,
but he
all right.
bought all the issues from this one on,
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
the the one that has dead center is actually the first issue, which is probably dated February. And
right, I think he went
if
back at well, if he did, he went back and bought that one
that's
later.
entirely possible, but if he found a source that said he bought an issue in April, that's not necessarily the April issue. That could be the third issue.
Yeah.
That's true. That's true. But
Because that's the way they tended to come out. The date on the cover was well in advance of when it appeared on the newsstand, and that
yeah,
was an attempt to stay on the newsstand as long as possible, and then
right.
eventually a new issue would come in.
The other sources that it is that in the other correspondence he said that Don Wollheim had the first story in it, and Don Wollheim has the first story in this one.
Nice.
So
Okay, yeah. If he said that in a letter or some other source, that's
yeah, which
and
I could dig up, but
yeah,
not
yeah,
right now.
yeah, the third issue, if it doesn't have a Don Wollheim story in the first,
It doesn't. Yeah.
then yeah, that would be good evidence.
So,
Okay.
Alec, yeah, did you have anything on Rocket of 19?
Yeah, no, this is actually kind of funny. So it turns out I have read this story, which I was not expecting. So this is an anthology. It's called 100 Great Science Fiction Short Stories, edited by Isaac Asimov, Martin Greenberg, and Joseph D. Olander. So I've had this book since I was 12. All right, this is one of the very first science fiction, probably the first science fiction short story collections I ever bought. And it's great because like these are short stories. So each one is maybe a couple pages, 2 or 3 pages, and they're usually really funny, really kind of inventive. Because a lot of stories, it's just the idea, right? The idea is the best part, and so these are that principle distilled to its essence. And it's really fun to go look back at the contributors because like it's got like Larry Niven, George R. R. Martin, Barry Malzberg, Damon Knight, Fred Pohl, Joanna Russ. I mean, a lot of writers who I would not read for decades. I read when I was 12 in this anthology. And it has the rocket of 1955. And guess who the actual author was? It's not the name credited in the issue. It is a C.M. Kornbluth story, per the authors list in this anthology. But yeah, it's a funny story. I recommend it very highly.
Actually,
but
it's
yeah.
in my best to see him Cornbluth. I just remembered that now. I'm pretty
Okay.
sure. Let me double check.
Okay.
Well, keep talking. But
No, that's great. I mean, this is actually this is fun because the odds I would have randomly read a story from a random science fiction magazine from this period that was not astounding are very low. So I'm delighted that I actually recognize one of those titles.
this is the opening story of the best of C.M. Kornbluth. Is the Rocket of 1955.
Okay, yeah, it's great. It's very dark. But yeah, so that would have been the first Kornbluth I ever read. I'm sure it made some kind of an impression on me at age 12. But yeah, this is actually a book I recommend to a lot of people who are trying to get into like science fiction for the first time because they're short. They're usually really engaging. I mean, you can see. I mean, I read this to pieces, and I still go through and read it almost like cover to cover every few years.
We have the first question in the chat, but
I have a
But-
question first. I'm gonna
Okay.
get in there.
yeah,
I wanna-
and this is live nerding, folks. Do you see
Yeah.
this? You're catching this all live.
I want to ask about Fear, Hubbard's Fear, which he sold to Unknown in 1940. And I just want to know what you think about that in terms of like a stylistically unique and groundbreaking work, and that it's sort of like internal and it's sort of uses madness and all of that. I'd love to know more about how that fits into that era of fiction, whether there was other stories like that. In the world of Philip K. Dick, a lot of scholars point to Fear as the really setting the ground for Dick's later psychological fiction.
That's a great question. So, in addition to reading, looking at every issue of Astounding, looking at every page of Campbell's correspondence, I also read as much science fiction as I could for this period. I read all of Campbell's fiction, obviously. I couldn't read all of like Asimov or Heinlein's fiction, but I read a lot of it, certainly from this period. And I read all of L. Ron Hubbard's science fiction from, like basically everything he ever wrote in science fiction or fantasy. All right, I do think that I have read more science fiction and fantasy by L. Ron Hubbard than anybody who's actually not a Scientologist. So I feel uniquely like qualified to kind of put his work into context.
I'm
So-
a big fan of the Final Blackout myself.
Yes. So here's the thing. Okay, I should preface this with like kind of like my Hubbard spiel, which is that it's very hard to acknowledge this, but Hubbard was a popular writer, right? He was a popular writer in his own right during this period. Isaac Asimov was a big fan. Heinlein was a big fan. A lot of readers were big fans, and I believe very strongly that if somehow we were living in some reality where the whole Scientology thing never happened, we would still see Hubbard not as like a first rank writer. He wasn't a Heinlein, but I think he would fit very comfortably into the tier occupied by people like Del Rey, DeCamp, Van Vogt. I believe that very strongly. I think we would mention him in that category. And the reason we don't is because he has been retroactively erased from the history of science fiction because we are embarrassed, and for good reason, by what happened after that. All right. And I'm not saying that these are all good stories. All right. I think 10% are readable. A lot of the science fiction, especially, is really bad, and it's kind of like contemptuous. I mean, Hubbard did not like science fiction. This is the other thing about him that I think is really fascinating, is that he ended up being associated with this like space opera Xenu myth, as part of Scientology. But he didn't like it. He didn't like writing science fiction. He did it because Campbell was a good market, and he and Campbell were kind of assigned to each other by Street and Smith. Um, so that Campbell could get more stories, and Hubbard was very happy to earn money this way. But he clearly likes fantasy more. He clearly is much more drawn to stuff like the Arabian Nights, and so a lot of his stories in Unknown are actually pretty good. I think his Unknown stories, for the most part, are much better than the stories he wrote for Astounding. Um, so Fear comes out of a period. I want to say this is just before the war. All right, this is just before Hubbard enlists in the Navy. After Pearl Harbor, and he is trying to get some kind of posting, during the lead up to Pearl Harbor, because he kind of sees that there's a war coming. And so I think what happens is that normally he just cranks out these stories, and they're mediocre at best. But I think there are three stories in this period that he spends a little bit more time on, maybe because he isn't cranking out fiction at the same rate, but he's otherwise occupied. But he spends a little more time on the stuff he does publish. There's Final Blackout, there's Typewriter in the Sky, and there's Fear. All right. Of those three, I think Final Blackout is the best. Actually, I mean that's actually a good novel. That's a novel. If it weren't by Hubbard, I would recommend like pretty highly. And Heinlein thought it was great. It made a big impression on fans at the time.
It's really
Fear,
amazing that it's before World War II when you read it. It's like hard to believe when you look at it retroactively that he wrote it in 39. Final
yeah.
Blackout. It's almost an anarchist novel too, like in a weird way.
You can always tell like when Hubbard is like kind of engaged by his own story, because sometimes he'll write stuff that's like very kind of like pro forma and like just kind of like for the money. Final Blackout and Fear, I would say especially are stories that seem to come from somewhere deeper, or as deep as Hubbard could be at that point. So Fear, to me is interesting because I haven't read it in a while. I read it when I first, was doing the research for Astounding. It has a very powerful twist ending, and that story, like there are parts that are very disturbing. Um, and that's another story that made a big impression on fans. I think it was Ray Bradbury who, I think he actually wrote like an audio play based on Fear and recorded it. He recorded himself in like, like an old-fashioned recorder, like narrating a version of the story Fear. And so I think Bradbury is actually someone where that influence is probably very clear. Um, but yeah, like I think there is this. I mean, I can't remember. Like, does Dick mention Fear at all as like an influence on his work?
Very much so. Yeah,
Okay,
in
all
a
right,
couple of letters. Yeah.
okay, yeah. I think. I mean, and you can see why, right? You can see why. I mean, I haven't thought about Hubbard and Dick as much as I have about Van Vogt and Dick. I think A. Van Vogt was a huge influence on Dick, and I could talk about that at length. But I think for similar reasons, right? I think Fear is kind of as close as Hubbard ever got to a Van Vogt kind of story, where it's about questioning your own reality. It's unsettling, it's uncanny, in some ways that I think are very, that sort of foreshadow other stories to come. And yeah, I think that's what Dick responds to. When he talks about Van Vogt, he says, these stories are just kind of insane. These stories like don't make any sense, and there are these like loose ends, and for some people, like that's a turnoff. But for him, it's like this is how the world actually looks. Like this is how reality actually is. And I think the stories that he talks about from this period, he pulls out stories that kind of get at that sort of sense of the world, in a way that you didn't always see in Astounding. Astounding tended to have a much more nuts and bolts engineering focused look at reality, but every now and then, like a really weird story like that would slip through.
So Nick asked in the chat, what are some of your favorite authors? Because you have favorite authors that are not of the four that you wrote about. I know this answer a little bit, but do you want to tell folks who are some of your favorite Golden Age authors besides these four?
Well, I'll talk about Van Vogt, right? Because he kind of like ties in most naturally with Dick, and he's the one where I wish. So people kind of ask me why I picked these people, these four authors. Campbell was kind of the obvious one. He's the central figure, all right? He is the through line protagonist of the story. And I picked the others because they knew Campbell and because they were around Campbell and there were stories about them interacting with Campbell. And that's the main reason, okay? If I were trying to write a book about the four most important science fiction writers of this period, it would be a different list. Okay, it would be a list, and certainly from like a commercial standpoint, the book might have done better if it had had people like Bradbury, if it had Clark, if it had people who are, you know, and if Hubbard weren't there, I think Hubbard, I think he adds a lot to the book, but people have asked me quite a bit, like, why is Hubbard there? Are you ranking him along these other people in terms of like literary quality? And I mean, the answer is no. I mean, and the answer is that he's important and I would be an idiot not to talk about his life because it's so interesting and so central to Campbell's life. But it's not like a value judgment. It's I'm not ranking my favorite writers here. These are the ones who, from like a narrative point of view, um, you know, were conducive to this kind of book, where Campbell is the central figure. And so Van Vogt, like Bradbury, never really hung out with Campbell. Like Van Vogt was an astounding author, but he was Canadian, and he and Campbell did not meet in person until way later. I want to say like the 50s. Like I don't think I realized this until later. But there are no real stories about Van Vogt and Campbell hanging out. Okay, so that's why he's not in the book as much as some other folks. But in terms of like who interests me the most, I mean, yeah, like I hadn't really read him before I started doing research for this book, and I read stories like Slam and World of Null A, and I couldn't believe that they'd been published in a pulp magazine in like the late 30s. It was incredible to me that you could go to a newsstand as like a 12-year-old and spend a quarter and get a pulp magazine that had the first part of the World of Null A, because these are really wild stories. And I have to say that Van Vogt is kind of at the same time the most advanced and the most primitive writer from this period. I think that's kind of true. I think if you read
Right.
his stories like on a page by page level, the writing is like really uneven. Some stories just don't hold up well at all, or at least certain parts of some stories don't hold up well at all. But you read them like, especially Noel A to me, and it's kind of what Dick said. It's like this guy is getting at something fundamental about the world and how we live in it that you don't find in someone like Heinlein, all right? That you don't find in someone where people act in rational ways. They approach problems in rational ways. In Van Vogt, it's like, you know, like maybe that's not the answer. Maybe there is no answer. And you get this kind of like sense of like dislocation and like uneasiness from him. And, often it seems kind of unconscious. You don't really know where that's coming from. But there's something like really primal and something really visionary that's happening in some of those stories that I don't think I saw anywhere else when I was doing research for this book.
Yeah, and Raymond F. James is one of your favorites, right? Go
Well,
ahead.
yeah. So this is so it's like caveat. So it's Raymond F. Jones, and I like his stuff in general. He is a Campbell writer who is not very well remembered. But he wrote my single favorite science fiction story. It's called Noise Level. So if we ever have a chance to do another, podcast together.
I promised you we would cover it on the podcast, and I
Okay.
will at some point.
All right. So I have a lot to say about Noise Level, and in some ways it's a very personal choice. It's a story that speaks a lot to me and kind of what I think science fiction it should be and is and was like during the Campbell years. But yeah. If people listen to this, have a chance, I would definitely check out the story Noise Level. Analog actually did for its 90th anniversary year, a few years ago, they did a feature where people would choose, like they would ask like former editors and people who had tied to the magazine to pick a story to reprint. And I picked Noise Level because to me that is sort of the quintessential astounding story.
Yeah, so you heard it here, folks. If you read it, I will get Alec back on one of my podcasts to cover it. So okay, we're gonna open up the floor a little bit more for questions, and I think Alec, what yeah, Frank wants to go, but I just wanted to say that I think one of the things that's really cool for us is because you're doing a totally different author and we're kind of stuck in PKD land, but it is really kind of cool to hear about somebody who's doing a lot of the same kind of digging and archiving and nerding on somebody else. But we're also interested in the history of the other peeps. And we haven't talked about Asimov much, so we'll definitely get to that. Frank.
Yeah, thanks, Alec. I read the book this week in preparation. I've had it for a while, and I had only skimmed it before. It's fascinating, and I definitely recommend it to anybody who's interested in this. The main question I have is when you're doing this sort of research where you're looking at autobiographical material in a lot of ways, either true autobiography or a big cache of letters. How, and that may be the only source you have on a lot of issues. How are you assessing the credibility of these sources? Because, I mean, for one thing, these four subjects, they're all sort of full of themselves in various ways, but their credibility to me and probably to you just runs the gamut from like compulsively honest to pathological liars. And with Dick, we face the same things just within his autobiographical material. Some of it is just brazenly lying, and some of it is very open. So just curious about that, how you approach it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because this is an issue that I have found myself grappling with, across multiple books. I read a book about Buckminster Fuller, who is absolutely someone who is like an inventor of of that persona, right? And you have to be very cautious about taking um, his recollections and his presentation of himself at face value. Okay, so half of that, I mean, I read a huge Fuller biography, and about half of it is like pushing back against the Fuller myth that he created. With Astounding, I would say I would rank these guys in order of credibility. I would say the most credible is Asimov. I think he, to a fault, is actually kind of honest about things. He
Totally.
obviously, yeah, he wrote, as you may know, several huge volumes of memoirs, right? Especially the first two are great sources for this period because he kept a detailed diary. And it's like almost like day by day, right? It's like an incredible book because you know what he was doing, where he was on almost every day of his life. And that stuff I think is credible. I think there are things he omits, and I think certainly there are ways in which he is not self-reflective in ways that become more clear as you think more about him. But I think Asimov is essentially a credible guide to the facts. Heinlein, I would say, is a bit of a self-mythologizer. Fortunately, there's a two-volume Heinlein biography about William H. Patterson, which, while flawed in some ways, is factually, as far as I can tell, fairly accurate. And so I was able to kind of fall back on that when I didn't have, like primary sources to work with. Campbell and Hubbard are the hard ones. Okay, Hubbard, obviously, you cannot take seriously as a source about almost anything. There's actually a line in the book where I talk about a pretty important incident where Hubbard meets Campbell for the first time and is essentially brought in to, like, as I was saying earlier, just write stories for Astounding. And I kind of describe that story, and in the book I say, like, Hubbard is our only source for this story, which is reason enough to be skeptical of it. But then I look at other sort of details and sources from that same period, and I say, well, the timing is about right. This reflects an actual change in the magazine. Hubbard's byline starts to appear soon afterward. Some of the names are correct, and so you kind of like correct things. You fact check things as much as you can. Hubbard obviously has been the subject of many other books, and so for certain periods, like Lawrence Wright and other writers have done a great job of checking that story. And actually, like, the materials from this period for Hubbard are pretty good. Like, they're pretty rich. And so, with some caveats, I can use those sources, and kind of have to make certain calls about what is trustworthy and not. And that's just kind of like the nature of this kind of book. Campbell, in some ways, was the hardest one because there's less written about him I couldn't like just say, oh, what did William Patterson say about Campbell or the equivalent, because there wasn't a biography of Campbell. That was why I was writing this book in the first place. So I really had to like, you know, be mindful of the fact that Campbell, when he told stories about his past, about his childhood, let's say, they're for a reason. He's trying to make a point. These are all letters where he's like making an argument to someone else about something, and he illustrates his point with a story from when he was growing up, let's say. Um, so when he talks about his mother, let's say, or his father, like these are good. I mean, he's the only source, but you have to realize, that he is, remembering these things from the vantage point of, decades later. He was incredibly, I think, bitter about the way he was raised. He had a lot of unresolved feelings toward his parents. And so again, like when it comes to that stuff, you have to be careful. You have to note that, this is Campbell's point of view. But again, like for the most part, there are very few things in the book Astounding where I ended up being unsure about what really happened. And whenever I am unsure, I try to like flag that. But for the most part, when you triangulate between your sources and like different perspectives, you kind of end up with what you think is the quote real version of events. But it is difficult, and there definitely are places where, as a biographer, you have to kind of like um, make certain decisions and be clear about the places where there's some uncertainty.
Yeah, for sure. And so Tom asked to a little clarification on Jones, Raymond F. Jones. Like, what was it about him that you found appealing?
Well, so really, it is this one story. All right. So he wrote another story, I think, called 50 Million Monkeys. That's really good. And I think I've read a few other stories by him, but it really is noise level.
Okay.
And I don't want to like give it away because that story, it depends on like kind of a twist that I think is very compelling. So I can't really explain why I like him. When we do this podcast, ideally, I will explain why.
Okay.
But
Well,
I'll put it this way. All right, noise level to me is the most compelling argument in favor of science fiction that I've ever read as to why science fiction matters. And it's an argument that I have not really seen made with this kind of clarity elsewhere. I'll just leave it at that.
okay. So I know we interviewed Barry Maltzberg for our show, and I know you interviewed him as well. Was that background for Astounding, or did you do it after? Did you interview him after the book?
Well, the audio interview that I conducted was after the book came out. Um, so my history with Barry is kind of interesting. What happened is that I was trying to find the Campbell estate, and Barry had worked for the Scott Meredith Literary Agency for a long time. And if you go to
Bill's agency as well.
I mean, the agency is amazing. Like you think about like who was there and like who worked there and who was a client there. I mean, I would love to read like a whole book about that place. But yes, so if you go to the SIFA website, there's a section for estates, and you can look up who is the person to contact for various estates. And this is like really early on in my research process. I was trying to find Campbell's family. No one had reached out to Campbell's family in many years. I eventually was able to reach them via just a snail mail letter I sent to his daughter, who's still alive. And she wrote back, fortunately, so that was kind of how I ended up reaching the Campbell family. But at the time, I was just trying to find them in any way I could. And so Barry was listed as the contact, which is totally wrong. He'd not been in touch with them in decades, probably. But he wrote back right away. I had, because it was his email address, and that was it. I mean, that was all I expected to do. And what happened is that he, at some point, found my blog. And this was a time when I was writing a blog post a day, and I wrote 100,000 words about science fiction stuff. It's insane. Like I don't know where that energy came from because it's gone now, but I read a ton of essays and blog posts about science fiction and stories I was reading and what I was uncovering, kind of in preparation for the book Astounding. And Barry really liked it. Barry, like I think he was just like gratified to find someone at that point under 40, who was reading these stories and who cared about these things, which he, I mean, he was very pessimistic. He was very bitter, and I mean, like it was palpable, like his sense of disillusionment about his maybe his own career, his own life, and kind of the direction that science fiction had taken. And so I think he saw me as kind of like a young person who was trying to keep this tradition alive. And so we ended up corresponding a lot. I recently published after he died. I put all of our emails online because there's a lot of good stories there. We talked on the phone, occasionally. We met in person once in New York. And yeah, I mean, I actually wanted to do a whole series of interviews with him originally, but what happened is that I don't know if you've actually like listened to like that interview, but Barry was
I
very
did a while
difficult.
back, but yeah.
Okay, he was a difficult interview because he has lots of
I
good
interviewed him
stories.
twice, I know.
Um, and and he knows all this stuff. Like you're like, if I could just get the guy to talk, he would tell me all these like great stories. But I would say, like literally, what I said to him is, tell me some stories about working for the Scott Meredith Literary Agency. And what he said was, well, I wrote a 10,000 word essay on the topic for fantasy and science fiction in
Yeah.
2004 or whatever. Just read that. And I'm like, number one, I find this stuff fascinating. I love the Scott Meredith Literary Agency. I don't have that issue. I could get it at some point, but I don't have it right now. Most
Tell
people
me.
listening to this are not going to like have that issue. So yeah, just tell me a few stories. So it was like that for hours. And so after a certain point, I was like, this is not going to end up being kind of what I envisioned. So I just put together what I had and put it online. And I think there are some good stories there, but it was more effort than I wanted to expend, I think, to kind of pry them out of him toward the end.
Yeah. I think we got the story from him of being in the room when Wilhelm heard that Man in the High Castle got nominated for the Hugo, and
Oh
how
yeah.
furious Wilhelm was because in his words it wasn't science fiction. And that was one that we got. Did he talk to you about meeting Campbell? Because yeah, and
Yeah.
he took the last interview. I don't know because he told that story to us both times, but the second time he told us a tidbit that he didn't really give us the first time was that he was talking about how nervous he was, and he said at one point Campbell put his hand on his shoulder and said, "It's all right, kid. I've been attacked by more people than you."
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, to me, that's actually a really moving story. I included it in Astounding. It's like prominently featured in Astounding because it's about a young guy who I think is seen, like as a critic of the golden age, right? Like ethos in science fiction. But he loved Campbell. Campbell was his hero, and they met once, and it was an incredibly difficult, disappointing conversation because Campbell at that point was reactionary and racist, and he Ray says that at the end he was shaking all over because he was so disappointed and sad with how that had gone. And then yeah, at the end Campbell kind of like gives him a little pat on the shoulder and says, "Don't worry, kid. I just like to shake him up." That's the version that I heard.
Yeah,
But no, I love that story, and to me that is such a
that's probably correct. I was anecdotally remembering it, so I'm
well.
sure you remember
I
better.
only like. I mean, he's written about that encounter. And
Yeah,
I think the version that I use in Astounding is just based on one of his essays. But yeah, really powerful. Okay, because the thing about Campbell that I always like to mention is that he was difficult and he was all the things people say he was. He was racist. He was reactionary. He was a crank toward the end. But people loved him. I mean, he was so important to people in people's lives. And I think people like Barry, like Asimov, they never got over it. They were never able to kind of like, like reconcile these feelings they had for this man.
mhm. So for our guy PKD, I'll get to you in a second, Lord RC. But he only sold one story to Campbell, but he worked with him twice because he also sold a script for Exploring Tomorrow, which Campbell was the host of. So he did work with him, or he did sell sort of two stories to him, although that story was eventually published by Horace Gold and Galaxy, the prose version of that script. But he didn't really work with Campbell, so he didn't really have a relationship with Campbell. He was on the West Coast, so he's not dropping by his office. And we also know that Dick also was very, you know, was so bothered by his mother being interested in Scientology that he wrote The Turning Wheel, right? And as you know, to criticize, a very on the nose takedown of Campbell in the turning wheel. So what do you know anything about, like, what Phil and Campbell, did they ever meet at a convention? Did we ever have that experience, or what do we know about the two of them?
That's a great question. I don't know if they ever met. Actually don't know, and I would love to find out.
He
I
only
know
met
that.
Wilhelm twice, even though
Okay.
Wilhelm published all of his stuff.
So Campbell did publish Imposter, right? It's the only story of
Yep.
Dick's that appeared in Astounding. And it's kind of like, so the key thing to remember here is that Dick was submitting the stories to Campbell. He submitted a lot of stories to Campbell. And Imposter was the only one, for some reason, that Campbell liked enough to publish. I know that Dick said that Campbell would be very demanding when it came to rewrites, and that even though Astounding paid the best rates in the field, after a certain point, it made more sense for Dick to sell stories to magazines that paid less than take the time would be required to rewrite a story to Campbell's specifications, right? But they didn't see eye to eye. All right, I have one quote from Dick where he says that Campbell referred to Dick's stories as, quote, nuts, which I think is a great description.
Right.
And that, I mean, they both had an interest in psionics, right? So this is like the late period Campbell, where he's obsessed by psychic powers and by these kind of like weird psionic machines that are supposed to like do weird things, if you touch them or manipulate them in certain ways. And so, there is like some overlap there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, Dick says that Campbell saw psionics as being like a central cornerstone of science fiction, that this is a subject that science fiction has to explore because it's an important, and from Campbell's point of view, it's real. But he said that the one difference between them is that in Campbell's stories, the psionic character, or the character with these powers, had to win, or he had to kind of be in control. Because to Campbell, like this was kind of like, like the next stage in human development. I mean, he wanted to develop those powers. I wanted to find ways for people to develop those powers. And I think with Dick, clearly, he is as interested in like the sense of powerlessness, of the lack of control. And so I think the odds of him writing a story about psionics that Campbell would find acceptable were very low. I think
Well, and
that's
he
a fair point.
specifically wrote A World of Talent and Psy-Man, Heal My Child in early 54, back to back, which were very anti all of Campbell's views. And it's very, I think, specifically, I don't know if Campbell had just rejected one of his stories and pissed him off or something right around that time. But he was definitely going after Campbell's views on that stuff in the early 54. Lord Running Clam, you had a question.
Yeah, Alex, my question was basically the same as your question. What did your research reveal, Alec, about this relationship between Philip Dick and John W. Campbell Jr.? Now, we've just talked about it from Dick's side, but how was it from Campbell? Did you find anything where Campbell wrote to Dick or commented on their relationship or his work or anything like that we have not been revealed to us before?
I mean, that's a good question. I don't recall offhand if I found any correspondence. I'm sure some existed, but and I could go back to my notes and see if anything comes up. I don't think Campbell found Dick that interesting. All right, and this is an important point. All right, because this is a period post Dianetics where Campbell is no longer at the forefront of the field. He's not developing writers in the way he was in the 30s and 40s. Galaxy, fantasy and science fiction. These are the magazines that are seen as kind of the avant-garde, in science fiction. And yeah, like Campbell's, I mean, the magazine was never the same. Like the magazine, it's very hard to find good stories, frankly, in Astounding / Analog after 1950. I mean, there are exceptions, obviously, including Noise Level, but like he was not interested in writers who, I mean, for the most part, in writers who did not write stories to his, sort of philosophical specifications, right? Like you had to be a Campbell writer in a way that was kind of true in like the 30s and 40s, but definitely was true after that. And so you see a lot of writers who were kind of either mediocre, but happened to, like have points of view that were aligned with Campbell's, or who were willing to kind of, you know, opportunistically write stories to order. So people like Robert Silverberg and Randall Garrett, you know, they knew how to write Campbell stories. So they cranked out these stories that, you know, they knew he would like. Um, and by the time you get to like the mid 60s, and again, like he publishes Dune, he publishes some like really important stories, but you know, like he does not discover a really important writer. I would say, at least not to the same extent he did, you know, in the 30s, and he was just not prepared to recognize that kind of talent. I think that's fair to say.
Well, and it's funny too because when he published Dune, his reaction was, "Congratulations, you created a Superman." Like that was what he saw out of Dune, right? He totally missed the
I
point.
mean, this is a whole other topic, right? But yes, like he definitely sees Dune as kind of like a slant sequel. Like he focuses on one aspect of the story, you know, Paul is
Mhm.
Superman, and then and it kind of ignores the rest, you know, even though there's a lot going on in that story. And then he rejects Dune Messiah, which kind of questions all the stuff that, you know, the first book, you know, like all these premises, you know, Herbert deliberately knocks them down. And Campbell, if you read his letter to Frank Herbert, you know, he's offended. You know, he's almost offended that Herbert would dare to write a story like from his point of view that was this bad, that was like, you know, this frustrating to the reader. So that to me is a very typical Campbell story from that period.
Okay, Tom's got a
Um,
good question, and we're going a little bit long, but we have a rare opportunity to talk to Alec here. Tom wants to know: was Heinlein's brand of libertarianism appealing to Campbell?
Mhm.
Um, so Campbell and Heinlein is, you know, a very complex story. All right. Um, so whenever I talk about Heinlein, you know, there are many Heinleins, right? Like this guy's politics evolved enormously over the course of his career. And you
There's
look at,
many
you know,
PKDs as well.
Yeah.
yeah. And you know, with Heinlein, you know, people associate him with a certain kind of politics, but you know, to me, like the Heinlein of the 30s, it's very hard to pin him down. Like he's essentially a socialist. You know, at least that's kind of how he appears to me. Um, and you know, he becomes more conservative uh in, I would say, the post-war period, you know, and that's a whole other story. What I find interesting is how close he and Campbell became. Both, I mean, so this is the exception when I say, you know, this is a story about people that Campbell spent time with. Heinlein and Campbell didn't hang out that much except during the war. All right, they were mostly on different coasts, but they were so aligned during this period. I mean, they essentially saw each other as I say in the book, like the adults in the room. Like they're a little bit older than the average science fiction fan and writer. They are both incredibly smart people, and they only meet in person. I want to say once before the war, and it's such a powerful experience because Heinlein and his wife Leslie go to New York and meet Campbell and his wife Donia, and they hang out for a couple of days, I think. But it is so intense that the Heinleins almost become like the godparents to the Campbell's second daughter. Um, I mean, it's really amazing, and I think it just kind of speaks to, you know, they saw each other as kindred spirits. Um,
And Heinlein was
Politically,
living in LA at the time, right?
yes, yes. So this is the point, right? They are not hanging out in the same way that Asimov and Campbell were hanging out every month. You know, Asimov would just take the train to, you know, the astounding offices, you know, and go and kind of sit and listen while Campbell told him things. Heinlein, you know, didn't wasn't physically there, but you know, the letters they exchange are incredible. I recommend looking them up. Um, and you know, I mean, Campbell was a very reactionary person. I mean, he was very radical in some ways in terms of the fiction he published during the early, you know, period. And a very weird person in a lot of ways, obviously, but you know, politically fairly conservative, you know, fairly reactionary. Um, and he did not align, and this is the point, I think. The punchline is that he was not aligned with Heinlein later on. I think he rejected a lot of the stories that we associate with kind of this period in Heinlein's career. I think he rejected Moon is a Harsh Mistress. I think he said he would have rejected Stranger in a Strange Land, in part because he saw Heinlein as devolving as a writer. He thought that Heinlein was at his best, and some people would agree, actually, you know, at his best in the 30s and 40s, and that the books that he wrote after that were really more about expounding this political slash, you know,
I would have
Uh,
rejected Stranger in a Strange Land. I'm, you know. Well,
So, it's a matter of taste, right? But
yeah.
Campbell did not like those novels, right? He did not like those novels, and he didn't like them because he thought they were propaganda. They were like attempts to package these ideas in fictional form, which is funny because like a lot of the stories that Campbell was publishing at the time were also propaganda for a different point of view. So yeah, long story short, they were so close during the 30s and 40s, and they broke apart for a lot of reasons. But yeah, I would say by the
And
end,
that's
they
really
were
when his
not aligned.
libertarianism developed.
Right,
Like,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, I have one more question for
And
you.
I have two.
Okay,
I have
we'll get
one.
to you. Yeah,
Let's do
but
it.
so one, I want to know about the influence because one of the most important people to PKD is Anthony Boucher, and Heinlein and Boucher were a part of the Manana Literary Society, which was their sci-fi club of writers that hung out in the early '40s in LA. Which, by the way, Boucher wrote a fantastic locked door murder mystery called Rocket to the Morgue, where it has thinly veiled, fictionalized versions of all the science fiction writers that were in that group, and I highly recommend Rocket to the Morgue. You don't have to highlight your copy like I did, but it's a fun read. What influence do you think Heinlein and Boucher had on each other?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I don't know as much about the West Coast scene, all right? And I think, you know, I want to say this right now. Someone needs to write a version of the book Astounding for the West Coast during this period. I think it would be a bestseller. I think it would do really well. Um, because you have Heinlein, you have Bradbury, you've got people like Lee Brackett, you've got Forrest
Jack
Ackerman.
France.
I mean, basically enough. I mean, Astounding.
Kuttner and Moore.
Yeah, yeah. Astounding. I'm proud of that book. I think it's full of good stories, but there's like an equally good book to be written about that West Coast crowd that would make it seem even more, or let's say, equally interesting as what was going on in the New York Camel Circle. Um, so I mean, I think the short answer is I don't really know. I think my knowledge of Boucher is based mostly on him as a peripheral figure in Heinlein's life, and to some extent Campbell's, or the science fiction community of that period. So I'm gonna like kind of opt out of that question just because I don't want to like go further than my actual expertise would merit.
Yeah, maybe I would love to maybe write that book one day, but I got a couple on my plate first. So LRC has a question, but first, Gil, go.
All right, I want to know about Asimov a little bit. I don't remember if his sort of juvenile escapades with women were detailed in Astounding, or if I came to be aware of them around the same time. But certainly, as of late, he's been sort of recast as this uh, not a Me Too kind of a guy. And I don't know exactly what my question is, other than, um, was that something that you worked on in the book, and how did you get evidence for that? And what do you think about how our view of these guys changes as we become aware of kind of how gross they were, for lack of a better word?
Yeah. No, this is a very important question. Okay. So just to clarify what we're talking about, right? Asimov groped women for decades, all right, and he would have started, I would say, during the war, when he's working at the Navy Yard in Philadelphia, and it became much more pronounced later on as he became famous. All right, he would be at conventions, and I mean, I don't want to like understate it. Like, I think he groped hundreds of women, if not thousands. All right, I think at every convention this happened repeatedly. I've seen many accounts of women who felt incredibly uh, like violated and traumatized by the way he touched them. Right, so that this is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And there are things that are even worse that I don't feel like getting into right now. So, and to me, this is a huge part of unfortunately, his legacy. I think it's very hard to overlook it. Um, in the book Astounding, I devote maybe a page and a half to this, and that book came out in 2018. All right, and this is before Me Too, and I've since felt some regret about the fact that I talk about it, but I don't really put it in context. And to me, the context is that this is behavior that young men who were also at these conventions saw And they're looking to Asimov as a role model, as like a model of how to behave. And I think that his celebrity and his prominence in the genre contributed to women feeling unsafe. I think that's kind of the big takeaway that I don't say in the book that I kind of wish I did. Um, so a couple of years later, I wrote an essay for a site called Public Books, where I kind of like say a lot of the stuff that I wish I'd said in the book. And ever since, I've been pretty diligent, I think, about raising these issues whenever I talk about him. Okay, even in context where people just want to hear about books or about the other stuff, because it's important, and I think it's important. It's very hard for me to talk about him and not raise these issues. And the question is, what do you do with that? I mean, I'm still years later. I'm still trying to work through what that means. I do think that Asimov, the things that I like about him, and there are a lot of things I like about him. I mean, I go back to those books all the time. And the things I don't like about him, they all kind of come from the same place. All right. I think the same attributes that made him a prolific writer and drove him to become, the most prolific writer in American history. I think it was actually Barry. I asked him about this, and he said like there was so much anger there. There was a lot of anger there that he never came to terms with. I think this is true. I think he had a lot of resentment about how he was treated growing up. He felt like an outsider. And I mean, he was then in a place where he could take out some of those feelings on people who were less powerful. There's I mean, he didn't grope for the most part. He didn't grope editors. He met a lot of women in professional capacities. There's some exceptions, but for the most part, he is going after secretaries and young fans, people who don't have like the power to object. I think that's very revealing. So yeah, so I mean, I just published an interview where I recommend my top 5 Asimov books, and I talk about this at the end. It's something that it, and unfortunately, it's often a subject where I spend half an hour talking about Asimov and his fiction and his nonfiction and his importance to the genre, and then at the end I say, oh, by the way, I should also mention this, and everything ends on kind of an awkward note. But I've learned that it's important, and I think on some level I'm going to be talking about this for a long time to come.
Yeah, Lord Running Clam, you had a question?
Yes, Alec. Let's go back to the beginning of Astounding. Now, as I understand it, was John W. Campbell, L. Ron Hubbard, Isaac Asimov, Heinlein. These were the 3 main people who founded that magazine, right? Now, I've not read your whole book. I got on Amazon and read the first 30 pages, which is all they'd let me read, okay? So I got that far, and I'm totally into it, and I shall be ordering your book. But you imply, or seem to imply, that Campbell wrote a lot of stories and then handed them to these other writers that they put their byline on, and then they published them in Astounding. Can you expand on that?
I mean, that's not quite what I'm saying. I'm saying that Campbell gave ideas to writers, and I think this is true in certainly Asimov's case. Okay, this is the important one, all right? They're like minor examples, but Asimov is so central to science fiction that I have to make this very clear that when he first met Campbell, he was, I think, 18. He was a young guy. He was a fan first. He had not been published, and he was looking for a mentor. And Campbell kind of like sees Asimov as this almost like an experimental subject. Like, what can I do with this kid? Right? He's clearly smart. He's eager. He's not a good writer yet, but maybe he could be. So I will kind of like guide him and kind of turn him into my kind of writer. And so, no exaggeration, the things that Asimov is most famous for from this period are the 3 Laws of Robotics, the story Nightfall, and the Foundation series, all of which I think are essentially Campbell's
ideas,
right? He gives Asimov the 3 Laws of Robotics. He gives him the premise for Nightfall, and Asimov comes to him with this idea of like, oh, let's do a story about the rise and fall of a galactic empire. Campbell's the one who says it's going to be a series, and it's going to have psychohistory. I think psychohistory is Campbell's contribution. Right. So that's one example. So Asimov, he later says, I had to write the stories. So it's not like Campbell wrote the stories for him. And a story like Nightfall would not be nearly as good if it were not written well. Um, but there's no question that and Asimov became the most famous science fiction writer of his generation. I mean, he was a Campbell creation in those early days. And after the war, he becomes more independent, and a lot of the stories he writes after the war are actually kind of reacting against, those early Campbell stories, as he starts to assert himself more as a writer. But that's just one example, and there are others that are less famous where Campbell sees himself as, I mean, that's his role. He is the guy in the office who is handing out ideas to writers. It's a model of editorship that doesn't really exist anymore. But he said, I mean, Asimov once asked him, do you ever miss being a writer? And he says, no, I found something better. I'm an editor. I can give ideas to 100 writers, and 100 writers will come back with different versions of the same idea. And so that's kind of, and Asimov says this, that
And
Campbell saw
Boucher was
himself
doing,
as like the overseer, right? Like everyone was
yeah.
kind of like, doing his bidding, right? They were like Campbell's clones, doing things that he couldn't do, didn't have time to do, or couldn't do in quite the same way.
And Boucher was doing the same thing with magazine and fantasy and science fiction in the 50s with his $1 Thursday night classes.
Mhm.
It Absolutely doing the same thing. And sometimes handing off ideas and saying, like, hey, Ron Goulart, this one's really good for you.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, well, Noise Level, the story that I'm talking about now, that I love, is actually a Campbell idea that he gave to Raymond F. Jones. So a really good story. I mean, essentially, it's better than the version that Campbell pitched. Raymond F. Jones was a good writer, but that story wouldn't exist if Campbell hadn't pitched it to him. After failing to pitch it to Heinlein, he actually pitched it to Heinlein at a point where those two men were not close, and you know. I think it's revealing that he tried to pitch this idea to someone who he was no longer close friends with, but who is the best science fiction writer he knew.
yeah. I have two questions in the chat. One is from Nick: Is have you read The Astounding, the Amazing, the Unknown? If you have, did you find the characters somewhat accurate depictions of Heinlein, Asimov, and Hubbard?
Okay, I'll answer that first. The answer is no. Okay, and the funny, so this is a novel, right? It's a novel in which Campbell and these writers are characters. The reason I did not read this when I was writing Astounding is that I did not want to be influenced by a fictional depiction of these people, right? Like this is a novel that is, has I've actually seen like cited as like fact in various places, including Wikipedia, which is like to me very funny because it's purely fiction. But I deliberately avoided reading it when I was writing Astounding, for I think for good reasons. And then I never read it after that. So the answer is no. I think at this point I'm probably safe. I can probably read it now without being influenced by it in any way. But I still haven't gotten around to it.
Frank, did you want to ask your question?
Sure. I was just interested in whether you or the publisher were concerned about, essentially getting flack from the Hubbard Scientology people, like the Barefaced Messiah bio had been back in the 80s.
Yeah, I mean, I was concerned. I mean, nothing bad has happened, to my knowledge. I know that people fairly high up in Scientology have read the book. I don't know what they think. I'm guessing they don't like it. I think we were actually entering like a different phase in the history of Scientology where they are not suing people anymore in the way they were, let's say, in the 80s or earlier. I think post Going Clear, I think that stuff's all out there. Like there's nothing in the book about Hubbard that it has not been discussed elsewhere, except like the stuff about his writing career. There was no good account of Hubbard as a pulp writer that I'd seen, and so that is the part that I think is actually a really valuable like contribution that I made relative to like other books about Hubbard. And so like there's actually like not that much there that they would want to go after me in particular, as opposed to say Lawrence Wright. I will say that I have talked to several ex-Scientologists who have asked me, the thing they're most curious about is, was Hubbard a good writer? Like what is the opinion of someone who is not a Scientologist of this guy's career? Because they've been raised, or they've been encouraged to see Hubbard as being the most important writer who ever lived, and they actually are very curious about like how he appears to someone like me who is not a Scientologist who has read all this stuff.
Yeah. And one thing we should mention, if people don't know, is that Campbell really jumped on the Scientology bandwagon in a heavy, heavy way in the early years. So did A. E. Von Vogt, as a matter of fact, too.
Yeah. Well,
And
I would clarify, I see Campbell as being essentially the co-creator of Dianetics.
yeah,
The Scientology stuff later on, that's Hubbard's stuff, but the early version of that therapy and that book especially is essentially Hubbard and Campbell as equal partners.
and Campbell got kind of cut out of the history of it because they had a falling out. And it's kind of sad, too, because Campbell still like tries to hold on to it after Hubbard's already kind of cut him out, which is one of the sad parts. And I'm talking about this authoritatively as if I didn't just learn it reading Astounding by Alec
Yeah.
Nevala-Lee.
Well, it's funny because, like, this is just a very quick aside. When I published Astounding, the stuff that people tended to focus on was stuff like Campbell's racist views, which are real. That is not like anything I would question, and it led to the Campbell Award being renamed and some other stuff. But I'm really surprised that no one has really picked up on like the Scientology genetics angle, because to me that was the scoop. That was the big scoop of this book. That Campbell was the co-creator of genetics. I think that is still an incredibly interesting story that I have not seen discussed as much as other things from this book.
Which is, by the way, one of the things that I think Phil was criticizing in the Turning Wheel was the whole like connection in science fiction. And like it's one of the things that when Dorothy came home to him and said, I heard about this really interesting thing called Dianetics, Phil, what do you think? And then Phil goes off the rails and is like super angry and like, no, don't believe that shit. It's because of his knowing all this stuff. And that's why he wrote the Turning Wheel, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, one thing I wanted to say very quickly is that Dianetics was like the biggest story in science fiction circles in 1950. It was by far the biggest event in that world, and I think Scientology took off because it had an existing pool of people to attract, right? Like it kind of it's like a viral phenomenon where you need an existing community for it to take hold. And I think in the case of Dianetics and Scientology, it was the science fiction community.
yeah. All right. Well, I want to leave some time for us to just be able to hang out and chat. But does anybody have?
I have a great question to transition from one discussion to another.
Okay.
And that is to talk about, just ask if Alec has any thoughts on the fact that I think 4 major science fiction magazines currently in the industry, it's Asimov's and Fantasy and Science Fiction, and I forget the other 2, were recently purchased by an investment group. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that. If you have any thoughts on the market for science fiction and magazine form today, and what the struggles are, where you think it might be going.
Wow. So this is actually news to me. So you're saying that this is a recent development?
I have information on this too.
Yeah, it's within the last, I'd say, 2 weeks that it's come out. It's
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, I invited Gordon von Gelder to come on, the previous owner of Magazine Fantasy and Science Fiction, to talk about it. And he said he's not ready to. Yeah, I've got him not ready to comment yet. But
Wow. Okay. This is actually okay. So this is interesting. Can I take 1 second to let's read the Locus article that see, it says that
let me just.
Analog, Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine, Asimov's Ellery Queen, and Fantasy Science Fiction have been acquired by Must Read magazines. All
Now,
editorial staff have been retained. Okay, well, this is interesting because I know Analog. I know these folks really well. I actually edit their puzzle feature. This is the first I've heard about this. So this is very interesting. I don't know. Like this is you're catching me like live on this podcast, like learning this news for the first time. I'm very curious now about what that means.
well, supposedly the guy who's behind the must reads, the investor, is a fan
Okay.
of the magazines,
Wow.
and he has claimed that he is not going to mess with them. I do know that the magazine of fantasy and science fiction cut down from every other month to 4 times a year, and they were struggling to even get that out
Yeah.
in the last period. I know because I'm a subscriber, and I've noticed them not coming to my mailbox. But the word is is that this was a move to save these magazines.
That's the
Wow.
optimistic take. The optimistic take is that these guys love science fiction and they are funding its continuation. The cynical take is that they view this as like an IP bonanza, or that it's
Wow.
something that they could use AI to get involved with,
Wow.
and things like
Okay.
that. So, it's very much remains to be seen, and I think it should be viewed as a sort of morally ambiguous move at the moment.
Wow. Okay. Well. Thank you. I had not heard this. This is actually a big deal. This is a big deal for me. I'm going to talk to some of these folks very soon for other reasons. I will ask because I mean maybe this is a good place for me to kind of like wind down because I should probably hop out after this. But I mean I love all these magazines, especially analog. I mean, I've been published there for a long time. I know Trevor, the editor, and Emily, Hockaday, really well. I know Sheila Williams of Asimov's really well. Um, and to me, like the tradition of print science fiction pulps or sort of digest-sized magazines is so important. I chose to publish an analog for various reasons, but I've stayed there for the most part because I love the idea of being in a print digest science fiction magazine, right? It's very exciting to see my name in print. And I mean, those magazines are actually at a huge disadvantage now because the Hugo Awards and other awards are currently uh, dominated by Tor.com and online magazines for good reason. I mean, they're much more accessible for voters. And so it's been a long time since anything from Analog or Asimov has won a Hugo Award. So I mean, it's tricky, right? It's like I don't know how I would navigate this new publishing environment.
Well,
I'm
supposedly
really
they
curious.
want to develop the online aspect so they can work as a
Wow,
hybrid. That's part of the whole thing.
wow.
Do we have any last questions for Alec before we? No, doesn't look like it. All right,
I
Alec.
just want to say, even though the book came out a long time ago, that is a remarkable accomplishment of research and stringing the whole thing together. And like I don't read a ton of books around science fiction. And it was just a really fantastic one. So I just wanted to congratulate you for creating a compelling story out of a ton of research.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank you.
I want to say too, it's really cool to have Lord Running Clam here with Alec too, because Lord Running Clam's been doing this for the PKD world, researching pink beams going back so far, and it's I see it's like we got a couple generations of researchers here, and it's really fun to have
Yes.
that kind of thing going on here live. Alec, where can people find your work and find your stuff and tell us about
Um,
the new book coming out?
Yeah, so I'm no longer active on social media, but I still have a blog. It's not super active right now, but you can email me via the contact page. I love hearing from people. And yes, so June 10th, I have a new book coming out. It's called Collisions, a physicist's journey from Hiroshima to the death of the dinosaurs. It's a biography of Louis W. Alvarez, who is a very interesting guy. And sort of my first venture into straight science writing, science biography, but an incredible story about someone who, again, like Campbell, had never been the subject of a book like this before. And whenever I see someone like that, I'm like, I should do it. I should grab this before somebody else does.
I know Louis Alvarez as a subject because I am studied physics and I use iridium regularly actually
Oh, nice.
in my day to day. So that's a very cool story. And
Wow.
look forward to seeing that.
Okay, yeah, if you like Iridium, you're gonna love this book.
Oh, I know. Yeah, that's awesome. I was actually trying to go to the KT boundary where you can see it in the U.S. just for fun. It's like Utah and
Wow.
Colorado, I think.
Wow, that's cool. I haven't done that yet, but I want to.
Well, and again, Alec, if you make it out to San Diego, we'll go to the science fiction room at SDSU.
Wow. Okay.
Um,
Yes.
And
That'd be great.
I know it's a short bus ride from my place, so I would love to have you, and we'll maybe do noise level here coming soon for postcards.
Okay. Yeah.
But
Anytime.
we can free you up if anybody else wants to stick around. We're just gonna what we normally do during this part of the live episodes or the hangouts is we just kind of chat and talk about the different work we're all doing, because we're all researchers and all that stuff, and we just have fun talking stuff. So for those of you at home listening on the Dickheads podcast, thanks for joining us. As always, keep it paranoid. Dickheads, we appreciate you, but if you see this, we're going to keep doing these live episodes. You could be here asking questions for our guests in the future. So thank you for joining the Dickheads podcast. And Larry, back at home, cut.